In the course of a project's lifespan, there are some very difficult uphill battles. One of them is obviously the mic settings that involve talking to the larger talking to the larger community. You love to see it. Oh man. All right. Shade Protocol. Everyone tuning in here today. We are talking regulatory frameworks. We're going to be talking regulatory frameworks, how Silk fits into the larger picture of the stablecoin narrative. What are some of the distinct legal advantages Silk has compared to other stablecoins? We're really going to jump through a couple of these hoops. I'll be recording this video as well, just like normal. And we'll be taking down the previous video as fast as possible. So without further ado, we're just going to jump right on in here. All right. So Silk and Shade today, we're going to be talking about the legal landscape. There's a lot of stablecoins currently in circulation. Last week we covered, or 2 weeks ago, we covered the brand of stablecoins. And pretty much the thing with having, 50 to 100 stablecoins, the problem with having an asset class just kind of magically pop up is that regulators are viewing this from a safety standpoint, which is totally fair. So we're going to walk through the various variables that the International Monetary Fund, the different regulatory entities are viewing stablecoins with. So what are the core functions of a stablecoin? One of the universal constants that have been kind of defined by regulators is that stablecoins, they have issuance, redemption, and a stabilization system. Finally, stablecoins can be represents a transfer of coins among users. And generally speaking, there's some sort of user interface defined with all of these stablecoins, which actually is kind of really unique to think about, that today, before stablecoins, the majority of our user interface is a debit card or a credit card or a physical piece of fiat. And more we're seeing this kind of lack of tangibility when we shift away from fiat system to this totally digital currency system. So the idea that like every stablecoin has to have a user interface is like a kind of an intriguing concept, because it's super obvious when you say it, but it's kind of profound in its own right. It's kind of representative of the continued innovation of payment systems away from physical devices, we'll say. Regulator and policy frameworks are expected to remain technology neutral and not hinder innovation while ensuring that it is safe and robust. This is my stance on stablecoin regulators. What is considered not hindering innovation? What is considered technology neutral? What is your standard for safety and robustness? Well, that's going to depend on who you are. That's going to depend on your relationship to the system. There's plenty of decentralized stablecoin users that are extremely comfortable with the risks. They believe that these stablecoins have a robust framework. They believe they're not hindering the larger macro economies, and they believe they're on the cutting edge of innovation. From a regulator's standpoint, they look at something like, let's say, MakerDAO, and they see a program. They see hundreds and millions of assets, user assets, that they have to protect. They're thinking about this from a sound money perspective. They're thinking about this from a, wow, all of these stablecoins are derivatives of fiat currencies. What are the implications of having billions and billions of dollars worth of derivative currencies that we didn't issue, right? And so the more you dive into the macro stablecoin space, the more obvious it is that this clash is inevitable. The question is, how is your stablecoin positioned in this macro narrative? Because regulators are coming, everyone. I just want to make that very clear. IMF, you can look up their October their global financial stability report, And they have an entire chapter. They have a 70-page report. There's around 20 pages dedicated to cryptocurrency. This is no longer a scenario where stablecoins are flying under the radar. There is dedicated International Monetary Fund monitoring of this asset class. We are no longer nascent when the most important financial entities are devoting research to the collective macro risks of stablecoin adoption. And look at this curve right here. We jumped from, in September of 2019, there was around 5 billion stablecoins. 2 years later, there's nearly $100 billion worth of stablecoins. If I had to guess, my gut tells me that we're going to look back on September 21 when it is probably 2022, 2023, and we will have issued $1 trillion worth of stable coins, which is why in the moment when everyone says, oh, like stable coins, there's not that many macro risks, we're a drop in the bucket, it's this kind of adoption curve that should open your eyes and say, wow, we could be dealing with trillions and trillions, tens of trillions, hundreds of trillions of stable coins. And what are the ramifications for end users? What are the ramifications for the banking system? Is it a good thing? These are all questions that regulators have already been asking themselves probably since 2017 and 2018. The ones that are actually aware of the tech were asking those questions in 2017, 2018, if not earlier. And now that we're here in 2021, it's full stop. Like this conversation is not disappearing. You know, on this list, Tether is clearly dominant. There's a lot of different scrutiny that's happening with Tether. Gemini, Binance, some of these bigger exchange-based currencies are backed by reputable entities, reputable banks, actually. So there's room for compliance for the people that are willing to play ball directly with United States banks. And just another example of the IMF tracking DeFi. And interesting enough is the credit ecosystem within DeFi. This is, once again, from regulators' perspective, they view credit and lending as a potential bubble in its own right. They view it as leverage, unregulated, high leverage, credit-based products. So I want to talk about Silk and the basket regulatory advantage, because Silk has two. There's one like edge case black swan event and idea I want to talk about, and I want to also talk about how Silk avoids this paradigm. So let's talk about stable coins as a derivative of a fiat currency. So if you picture the US dollar and the central bank's ability to issue currency as a layer one system, then fiat derivatives in the form of a stable coin are a layer two fiat system. And so the danger that regulators are facing when they're looking at these one-to-one derivatives is they no longer have direct control of all issuance of their underlying fiat currency. That is a massive risk. To date, the central bank has full control over issuance, right? That is an absolutely enormous point. And so the fact that we're suddenly having this derivative layer of stable coins that are supposedly one-to-one with the dollar creates an entire new set of risks. What happens if there's suddenly 20 to 30 trillion worth of one-to-one derivative US dollars on top of the fiat layer one, we'll call it? What are the risks of that? Imagine the derivative system of stablecoins breaking down for whatever systematic reason. Think about how that's going to deeply damage the fiat system in the United States as a quote-unquote layer one protocol, right? That would be a catastrophe. And so I think we can be really short-sighted to be upset at sovereign nations for wanting to regulate one-to-one derivatives to their respective sovereign fiat currencies. There's an immense amount of risk attached to stablecoins that are completely unknown from a regulator standpoint, based off of how much adoption, how much growth there's going to be in the vertical. And so this is probably Silk's two biggest advantages, which is really the same one, but said two different ways. Silk is not a direct one-to-one derivative with any given sovereign currency. That is huge. That is absolutely huge. You could think of Silk almost as, if we're going back to kind of protocol analogies, Silk is almost like a protocol that sits outside of any given system that all the different layer 1 fiat systems plug into, right? Because Silk is a basket of currencies. Currently, we're targeting 20 different global currencies, or 20 different, the basket consists of the top 20 largest economies in their respective fiat currencies. So we're almost bridging to those one-to-one systems, and we're sitting outside of any one of those given layer 1 fiat protocols. This gives a level of interoperability, and Silk is the intermediary between the volatility that any given single sovereign currency inherits in terms of its macro variables. And because Silk is not a one-to-one derivative with any sovereign currency, there is less regulatory scrutiny. I have got that confirmed from people. I have talked to reputable banking individuals in the crypto space, and being an index currency puts you under less regulatory scrutiny than being a one-to-one derivative with the fiat currency, which makes total sense, right? If I have a stable coin and the US dollar is 20% of the peg, let's say, the US government's going to care less about that index currency compared to a one-to-one equivalent with the US dollar. Now, the downsides of kind of this index currency, this kind of interoperable layer 1 currency in relation to fiats being like layer 1 protocols, is people get worried about currencies that become new global hubs for transactions and settlement. So I think that's where the macro narrative of Silk is going to be disruptive, is that the G7 and the largest countries on the planet, if Silk starts to gain traction as a literal standalone interoperable currency, we'll say, that is going to scare some people, right? Like the one trade-off of having those one-to-one derivative sovereign currencies is those respective regulatory frameworks can flex, right? They can actually flex. They can clamp down on those stable coins. But if you're outside of any given system, it is then up to a multitude of those layer 1s to choose to not play ball with, in this case, Silk, right? So I think that's what my gut instinct says, that Silk's going to do extremely well in the first couple of years. And at some point in time, when it reaches a tipping point, there's going to be a collective set of countries, we'll say, that look at something like Silk and say, what the heck do we do with this thing, right? Another component I haven't even talked about, and I should have included this as a third bullet point, is Silk is an algorithmic stablecoin. So regulators to date are able to, the idea of a reserve-backed stablecoin makes a lot of sense, right? Like, that's not some grand deviation from existing financial systems. The risks of reserve-backed stablecoins is you have so much capital potentially sitting in those reserves that you're once again creating an existential macroeconomic threat to the underlying layer 1 fiat protocol, right? With Silk, we don't really have to worry about that regulatory fear, right? Like, because it's algorithmic, it's not a crazy amount of reserves It's just sitting somewhere in the real world that could, create some sort of black swan event. Which is why I think a lot of the regulatory scrutiny over something like an algorithmic stablecoin will be about the stability of the system. But I would much rather die on the hill of this stablecoin is in fact stable versus dying on the framework of, oh, I have a bunch of money in a bank account somewhere backing the system. Please do not tell me that you're going to come in and shut this whole thing down, or that you're going to regulate the heck out of it, right? I think algorithmic stablecoins are so ahead of the curve and are going to be super confusing for regulators to handle. So I don't really have much of a thesis on regulators' stance on algorithmic stablecoins, except that it's far more complicated to think about than reserve-backed stablecoins. And so that's probably going to buy algorithmic stablecoins a couple of years of regulatory framework breathing room, which is a good thing, right? That gives you space to sprint ahead, become adopted, and we'll see the ramifications of that. But the issuance of a stablecoin in an algorithmic system is based off of the demand of the stablecoin. It's not directly tied to a collateral sitting somewhere. So it's helpful. So I just want to talk about a couple of variables from the regulator standpoint, things they're looking for. They're looking for legal certainty. They want to make sure that there's a standardization of rules that stablecoins are following. That's kind of legal certainty, and that all the entities involved with the issuance are following that. Sound governance. There needs to be very clear publication of the stability mechanisms and the governance mechanisms. Regulators are not going to let stablecoin governance be a black box, right? Regulators aren't going to let stablecoins be super centralized. There has to be a degree of decentralization, and there has to be clear documentation and publication of how the stablecoin stabilizes itself. There is the money laundering, terrorist financing, and other forms of illicit finance. This is one that Silk will probably come under scrutiny at some point. This is an inevitable trade-off whenever you introduce privacy into the equation. Ironically, the other one that regulators care about that no stablecoin has truly done to date is data privacy, protection, and portability. So you'll notice that money laundering and terrorist financing, this type of KYC, AML, is in direct, stark contradiction to data privacy, protection, and portability. If it was a straight line and there was a slider on the straight line, they're on opposite ends. Fortunately, with Shade Protocol, we could definitely bridge this gap by at some point someone building a KYC platform where your on-chain data is encrypted and protected, but because you're KYC'd, you're still able to comply to money laundering, terrorist financing, and other forms of illicit finance. You'll be able to properly comply with those rules while simultaneously having data privacy. So I think we'll definitely see that type of product down the road at some point. There's the tax compliance component. They want they want to be able to earn money from any similar to how a gas token benefits from more usage of on a layer one. Fiat systems need to be able to benefit from usage, right? And that's where taxation comes in. So if you're going to have a bunch of stablecoin one-to-one derivatives, the government wants in on taxing that. That's just that, and that's kind of a, if you think about it from a crypto standpoint and a blockchain standpoint, that actually makes total sense, right? That there should be taxation of one-to-one derivatives. I think that makes total sense. And then there's the cybersecurity and operational resilience. If you have, $50 billion worth of stablecoin on some algorithmic stablecoin, I think it's very fair that there should be an intense amount of cybersecurity and operational resilience involved in that before we say, oh yeah, that's compliant, that's safe for end users. This one, cybersecurity and operational resilience, is going to continue to be one of the biggest thorns in DeFi's side. Cream Finance had the massive hack the other day. We have the Titan rundown to zero when that stablecoin broke. Whether it be a hack or whether it be bad economics, regulators will attempt to protect investors and end users' money. Period. End of story. Full stop. And that kind of goes back to the safety, efficiency, and integrity of payment systems. So I want to briefly transition to Mirror Protocol and Do Kwon. I've had a lot of questions about we know that Shade Protocol has some unique synthetics on the way. What do you think about Mirror Protocol and the regulatory scrutiny of synthetic assets? A very fair question. I just want to make it clear that litigators defending Do Kwon are suing the SEC on the basis of how Do Kwon was served at Masari, not about any outstanding case about Mirror Protocol. I just want to make that clear because there's a lot of recent PR and media that came out that made it sound like kind of TFL was going after the SEC on the basis of Mirror Protocol, but that's just simply not the case. I am very curious about official frameworks for synthetic assets. Once again, these don't really exist. The only thing we know is that if you are hosting U.S. stocks in the form of a synthetic asset, they're probably going to come shut your front end down, and you're probably going to get sued for it, right? But we don't actually have a path to compliance and clear rules when it comes to synthetic asset derivatives that are one-to-one with a United States issued security. So with Shade Protocol and any synthetics that come, there'll definitely be an avoidance of U.S. issued stocks until, and really any country's securities, until there's a lot more regulatory clarity offered up on this front. I think that's the safest stance. I don't see too much harm in waiting. There's plenty of other synthetics that can be issued that have nothing to do with securities that are still wildly valuable and helpful, and in some ways uncorrelated to Shade Protocol, and therefore, building value for Silk, building places for Silk to live separate from the actual protocol itself. So excited to see where synthetics go. It's a wild asset class. There's a lot to be discovered on that front. And so another part is, to date, everyone's been doing the, over-collateralized synthetics model, but really, Shade Protocol Synthetics is the first ever algorithmic synthetic asset protocol. In my opinion, this potentially could have less legal scrutiny than the over-collateralized model. Don't take my word for it. Not a lawyer. That's just kind of goes back to the idea of regulators still don't know what to do with algorithmic stable coins, right? So kind of same rule should apply to what the heck do we do with algorithmic synthetics. No one's done the model before. How can we as contributors and builders predict the regulatory framework for a model when we're the first to do it, right? Like that's a very uphill task. So we'll see what happens on that front. Also, shout out to TFL. If any sort of major litigation goes down with Mirror Protocol, they're really leading the fight for the entire domain on this front. So they'll be spending the big bucks, and we'll get to learn from what it takes to be compliant. So that is the presentation for today, everyone. I'm going to switch back to webcam here and jump into questions. All right. Okay, so John Francis asks, how will voting for reweighting the basket work? That's a great question. So last night, I was up till, it's a fun story, I was up till 5 a.m. actually writing a white paper. Let me read the title of it for you. The title of the white paper is Silk, Global Volatility Shock Absorption via Standardized Currency Basket. So it is a 5-page white paper that walks through the precise mechanics of the basket, what it consists of, and how the reweighting happens. But long story short, the way you transition is every currency has a certain weight percentage, right, within the peg. And that weight percentage means you're contributing a certain amount of that underlying currency to the peg, right, to the basket. So when you transition the weights, all that happens in that brief moment of time when governance votes in, hey, we would like to adjust the weights to this new target, essentially the weights change and the target price stays the same, and that's the migration is actually pretty seamless. I was at a restaurant right now with one of the core core contributors, and we sat there with a napkin at the dinner table walking through the peg migration process. So we have it mathed out how the peg migration actually works. I think the bigger challenge for governance on this front is is there going to be like 10 people that propose what the new weights should be? What is the user interface going to look like for governance as it pertains to weights? Is that a different user interface than like the rest of the interfaces, right? So there's definitely some questions at large with how governance itself, like what that user interface will look like. I look forward to having that be built out and getting community feedback from that. But at the end of the day, we'll break it down into 3 components. It's what currencies and assets are a part of the peg, what are the weights, and what's the date at which like the transition is going to happen. What's the value that's it's being pegged to, right? You can really choose any value, by the way, for like your target peg, which is a really trippy concept. I talk about it more in the paper. So like there's like a couple of variables that are quite strange, but those are the 3 ones that governance is really voting on. When does the transition happen? What are the weights? What are the currencies and assets that make up the peg? Hopefully that answers that question. There's still a lot at large. I think the white paper that we'll be putting out there will offer up a lot of resolution on that front. Okay, can the currencies in the basket change? For example, if one of the currencies is going to take a huge hit from a new economic policy, would we be able to drop the currency? So Fetty, you absolutely could. There's nothing stopping governance at any given moment from voting to change a weight, voting to change the basket of currencies. There could be some risk in constantly and consistently changing weights. The main idea is we're using something called, we're really using a cross between the SDR IMF standard as well as WOKU, which is a world currency 20 currency peg system that came out in like 2009, 2010. We're really using a hybrid of the two for kind of benchmarking. And one of the beauties of standardization of weight changes and weight updates is that you no longer struggle with sovereign currency bias. So governance, if they voted to change one specific weight, would essentially be taking a socio-economic stance on the peg. And it's decentralized governance. No one can stop governance from doing that. My hope would be that, generally speaking, it's a biannual update. It follows a rigorous standardized process. In this case, the initial weights are based off of the top 20 GDPs and the relative GDP percentages in relation to each other, as well as the currencies attached to those GDPs, right? So it really creates like a closed system of mirroring value in the real world. And if people want to deviate from that idea, there's nothing stopping decentralized governance, right? Like that's blockchain in a nutshell. Are there plans for marketing Silk to smaller businesses in developing countries? These businesses don't have access to good digital payment infrastructure without paying fees they can't afford. Absolutely, Fetty. I think one of the biggest mistakes a American and European biased stablecoin project could make is thinking that the majority of growth comes from these countries, right? Like emerging economies are rapidly adopting stablecoins at a rate that's like just unheard of. So definitely have plans for targeting the classical regions like the Vietnams of the world, different countries in Africa that are just, and actually the Middle East is another one that most people don't talk about. The Middle East is seeing a huge amount of adoption with crypto. So we have plans for this. We're going to find product market fit where competitors haven't gone. And we'll go places that people aren't willing to go right now, because I think that's opportunity. So basic question for clarification. SSCRT has the origination address public, but the destination encrypted. Yeah, so SCRT, all you see is that some address interacted with a contract, and that contract obscures everything else. The only information people have publicly is address A interacted with contract B, and then B handles any sort of transaction, like who the end destination address is, what the balance is. That's completely encrypted. And in fact, I will let me link a video real quick. SSCRT versus secret. I actually made a video on this that might be helpful for you. I walked through the JSON file, so you can actually see, you'll actually be able to see like the privacy on the file itself, which I think is pretty cool. Anyone can do this, like on secret nodes. You can actually view the JSON file. For those of you who don't know what a JSON file is, it's essentially how servers talk to each other, is with a certain file format, and it's just like text, and it's brilliant. Let's see here, videos. Where are we at over here? Here it is. I couldn't find the title, but I found it now. I'm gonna link you in chat. Here is the link to that video. Hope you enjoy. Not that one. Here we go. Okay. Can we add a currency like Bitcoin to the basket? Absolutely. We can add any number of any assets as long as there is an Oracle data feed that provides the quote rate, which in this case, the reference currency is the dollar, which is nominal, right? Like using the dollar as a reference currency is nominal. It doesn't actually impact the underlying weights, but it is helpful to have a single currency in terms of like programming and determining the amounts of any given currency's contribution to the basket. Also, what's the daily burn cap? Has this been determined yet, daily/annually? So right now we're tentatively targeting for a default value of 7.75% of total supply, capped on an epoch daily basis. So this would mean that you go 7.765 or 7.75 divided by 365, and that's how much shade/silk, because it's hard capped in terms of shade, but it's really if you're minting silk directly with entry minting, you're actually routing through the shade contract. That's the hard cap of allowable value that can be pushed into the system. So the nice part about this is if shade price goes up, that door gets larger in terms of value. It's still hard capped in terms of the number of shade, but there'll be more value capture on the treasury. So we should all be crossing our fingers that shade price goes up, because it'll be very helpful. What factors are implemented to prevent this governance from becoming centralized by a few who dictate everything? So, Fetty, I think decentralization is always a struggle, because there's two types of decentralization, right? You have the decentralization of the actual token that involves voting, and then there's the decentralization of opinions. And currently, I am the most centralized point of failure when it comes to governance and when it comes to protocol vision. I think that's fair to like put myself out there and say I have like a pretty strong influence. I'm like a pretty core contributor to the project. So my hope would be that once all of this launches, that I can play less of an involved role, and we really let the DAO and the community members step up and play a distinct role in talking about strategic direction for Silk, right? I'll obviously still be here. I'll still have a voice. My fear is that you see some project, and I think I'm one of the more vocal, people in terms of, like, there's a lot of protocols where developers that are leading it, they're just like dead quiet. You don't know anything about them, but obviously I'm a pretty like public figure. I just want to be careful with the weight of that responsibility, because having a centralized figure that has a very clear strategic direction can be helpful for the protocol, but the trade-off is that it's centralized, right? So I want to decentralize the vision to everyone. I'd like to play less of centralized role in that sense. In terms of actual token decentralization, I can say this. We've looked at other VC coin projects. We've looked at a lot of other product launches, and Shade Protocol definitely has the potential to be very, very decentralized. So I'll say this: take a look at Terra Luna's decentralization. It's not good at all. So I think we will be significantly more decentralized than any other algorithmic stablecoin to date. So That's not to say there isn't, big entities or whales that will play a big influence. It just means that like our starting point is a lot better off and will be into perpetuity. So guys, thank you for watching today's episode. I apologize for the mic issues. Thank you for being willing to work with me and be patient while we got that figured out. I hope you all have a wonderful October 30th. Enjoy your Saturday, and stay tuned for the Silk stablecoin basket of currency global volatility reduction white paper. I'm excited to release that at some point. And as well as, stake. Be sure to stake, guys, before November 7th. Get ready for Shade Snapshots. It's going to be a good ride. Is there a WorldCoin orb you hold? No, I'm not holding. I'll say this here publicly. I'm only holding Secret right now, believe it or not. So I'm a very, very committed to this ecosystem. So has there been development into making Shade bank run resistant? So there is a feature that I haven't talked about yet. I was flirting with the idea of talking about it today, Gabriel, but I've decided to hold off until I finished off writing the white paper, circulating it internally, and kind of getting approval from the core developers on the system. Yeah, no BTC. I'm like entirely leveraged into this ecosystem, and yeah. That's the name of the game. Yeah, I have a better mic, actually. Game Sequence, I have, what's it called? I have one upstairs. My roommate was sleeping because it's a Saturday, and I wanted to not disrupt his sleep, so I decided to go downstairs, and I thought, I'll just use the laptop mic. Surely there'll be no issues. Start the OBS stream. Everyone's like, you sound like a smoker. And I'm like, oh, shoot, here we go again. Has there been development for secret savings accounts similar to Anchor Protocol? Mike, what I would say is this. Silk will, I can't say this public. I can't say it publicly. I'm sorry. I can't make that bold of a claim yet. Silk is definitely looking to integrate with stable yield products. That's what I'll say. Do we compete with Luna and Maker? I think there is so much room for stablecoin growth, and Silk is uniquely positioned as an index stablecoin that I think that it's not necessarily direct competition. I think having a scarcity mindset when it comes to competition, especially in a space that grows this quick, is, it's iffy. But on paper, yeah, we're competitors with other stablecoins, right? Like if your thesis is, which stablecoin has the most market capitalization, which stablecoin has the most adoption, then if you have a stablecoin, you're by default a competitor with the other stablecoins, right? Like that's like a very logical way to think about things. I think of it in a little bit more of a long tail vision for Silk and adoption, and like I think there'll be hundreds. I think there'll probably be somewhere between 10 to 30 stablecoins that really take off over the course of the next like 2 decades, similar to how in the fiat layer 1 system there is about 5 to 20 currencies that have really taken off. So I think it'll be a similar probably like power law distribution of those stablecoins. So anyways, thank you all for your time. Have a wonderful day, and onwards and upwards. Let's keep building Shade Protocol. Keep spreading the word.